Hi, and welcome to another episode of Coffee with My Friends. Well, today I'd like to address a very timely subject, something that's happening right now, the blood moon triads. We're coming up in September where we'll have the fourth blood moon, and I'd like to share with you today a little bit of information that I've discovered about it that I think you'll find interesting. So grab a cup of coffee, go grab a friend, and let's take a look at this teaching, Blood Moons Revisited. Now, Blood Moons Revisited, the reason I came up with this term is because I've been studying the blood moons for several years. I first found out about the blood moon triads when I started listening to Mark Biltz back in about 2009. A friend of mine introduced me to the blood moons and the importance of the feasts. And that's when I began to study the feasts and Sabbath and Torah, and that's when my husband and I got into the Hebrew roots movement. Now the blood moons are in full swing. We've already had 3 blood moons and the solar eclipse in the center, and we're coming up on the 4th blood moon in September. Well, for those of you who may not be familiar with the blood moons, let me give you a little bit of review. The blood moons, you can take a look at this slide here. A lunar eclipse occurs when the moon passes behind the earth and blots out the sun's rays from striking the moon directly, thereby giving it a blood red color, also called a blood moon. A solar eclipse occurs when the moon passes between the sun and the earth, thereby darkening the sun. Now these blood moons, which began April 15, 2014, and then this September 28, 2015, are happening right now. They are very rare. They've only happened 7 other times in history, and we're going to take a look at that as well. But I would like to show you why these blood moons are important. People understand that the blood moons are a sign of something, but a lot of people are interpreting these signs as the coming of the Rapture in September, the coming of Yeshuah, the rise of the Antichrist. They're looking for some event to happen on the September blood moon, which is just in next month. I'd like to propose to you that the blood moons are not warning of an event, but they are warning of a period of time. So let's take a look at that. Now you can see in this first slide, we have the blood moons that started in Passover on 4/15/2014 and happened on Sukkot. And then we had the solar eclipse, which was Nisan 1, which happened on March 20th of 2015. Then last Passover, we had another blood moon coming up on the Feast of Trumpets next month on the 13th. This is Rosh Hashanah, or the Feast of Trumpets, and we'll have a partial solar eclipse. And then culminating with the final blood red moon on Sukkot, September 28th of 2015. And as you can see, a lot of people are expecting Yeshuah to return at that time. There's a lot of talk on the internet about that right now, but let's take a look at some other things. This amazing phenomenon of biblical blood moons has only occurred, as I said, 7 times in history, since 3000 BC. What makes these blood moons so special? There have been 7 blood moon triads that have occurred on biblical feast days in history. This current triad is the 8th one. There will not be another triad on feast days for another 600 years. Now that alone should make us sit up and take notice, because that's a very rare occurrence. Think about that. In 3,000 years, we've only had 7 blood moon triads. And again, a triad is when a blood moon eclipse happens 4 times in a row with no other solar eclipse or lunar eclipses in between. Lunar eclipses in between them. And the fact that they turn red from the shadow of the moon. And the fact that they've only occurred on feast days 7 times in the last 3,000 years is very significant. Now this particular blood moon triad is the 8th one. Think of it, another blood moon triad on the feast days is not going to happen for another 600 years. But this blood moon triad is very significant and unique in a lot of other ways as well. What makes this so special? A friend of mine introduced me to this website, bloodmoonscoming.com, about a year ago. This website was developed by a gentleman named Paul Grievous. He's a statistician who has studied all 8 of the blood moons. He researched and charted all the sun and moon eclipses that occurred in the years before and after each of the triads, and he found a pattern. So let's take a look at some of the blood moons that he researched and see the pattern that he discovered. I think you'll find it interesting. Here's the first blood moon we're going to look at. This occurred in 842 and 843 AD. Now you can see in this chart, in the very, very center, you can see the 4 blood moons, Passover tabernacles, Passover tabernacles. But around them, he charted out all other solar and lunar eclipses on each side of those years. And you find a pattern. They're equal, but they're not equal in distance. For example, you can see right above these 4 Passover tabernacle blood moon eclipses, you see a little thing that says 3 years and then 6 years. This is showing that the blood moons were not equal in distance or in years. So this is not a perfectly symmetrical blood moon. It's still very interesting. A lot of things happened at that date. Now let's look at another one, and we'll see the same pattern happened. This blood moon triad happened in 1949 and 1950 AD. Now that's going to seem familiar to a lot of you because what happened in 1948? Israel became a nation. So right after Israel became a nation, we had blood moon triads that began in 1949. But again, look at this chart and you'll see a very similar pattern. You have the blood moons in the center, Passover tabernacles, with a midpoint. In this particular midpoint, you see a solar eclipse on the Feast of Trumpets in 1950. Very interesting. And again, you'll see the solar eclipses on the top, the lunar eclipses on the bottom. Then this tetrad was not seen by all the people in Jerusalem. So this is an interesting phenomenon as well. Now you notice with these 2 blood moon tetrads that he's calculated, neither of them was symmetrical. Even this one in 1949, 1950, it had a space of years on each side of the blood moons, on each side of the midpoint, that was not symmetrical. However, the blood moons that are happening right now, we're going to see the last one next month. Let's take a look at that chart and see what he discovered. This is one that Paul Grievous has called the Lord's perfect sign, and let me show you why. You see the 4 blood moons in the center again, although the final blood moon that's happening next month during Sukkot is called a supermoon, which means it's very, very large and is going to be seen in Jerusalem as well. You can see the midpoint, the tetrad midpoint, right down the middle, the line down the middle. And that midpoint was January 5th of 2015. You can see how he's charted out on each side on the top, the solar eclipses, and on the bottom, he charted out lunar eclipses going all the way out to 2019. So he charted these from 2010 to 2019. But if you notice this chart, you can see in the letters in green, the numbers in green, on the top, 1,461 days. On the other side of the midpoint, 1,461 days. Under that, 1,314 days, 1,314. Continue to go on down and you will see that this midpoint shows equal years or equal days on each side, making this a completely symmetrical blood moon triad. Now when my friends showed me this, I was blown away. I thought this was amazing and I was sure that it has some significance. But at the time I didn't understand what the significance was. Knew it was important, but I didn't know why. So what does Brad Scott teach us to do? Set that aside until we get smarter. Now, so let's set that aside. We're going to set those blood moons aside, but remember that chart. It's going to be important here in a little bit. I'd like to share with you another thing that I discovered probably about 5 years ago, and this is called the Shmita year prophecy. Now, the Shmita year prophecy that I'm talking about predates Jonathan Cahn's prophecy. He talks about the Shmitas, and that's true. There are 7-year Shmita cycles happening right now. A lot of you have studied Jonathan Cahn's teachings. But this Shmita year prophecy predates that, predates Jonathan Cahn's. Let me tell you the story about this. This is called the Shmita year prophecy, the year that everything changes. It was discovered by a Christian Bible teacher named Billy Brim, who spends much of her time in Israel. In her CD teaching called The Judgment on the Nations, Sister Billy tells of hearing this Shmita year prophecy in May of 2001 while in Jerusalem. Billy tells the story like this. As she was having lunch in the Hebrew Quarter, a rabbi came up to her table and began talking to her. He told her that on September 11th, 1999, it was called the day that everything changes, and that on that next Rosh Hashanah, September 29th of 2000, a war cycle would begin that would continue until Messiah came. So Sister Billy went to check this out with her friend Chaim Richmond, who heads the Temple Institute in Jerusalem. Sure enough, he confirmed what the rabbi told her, adding additional information. Regarding September 11th, 1999, it was also the day that the final judgment of the nations occurs. Very, very important. So this is, now understand, this is a Jewish prophecy that has been around for quite a while. And Billy just happened to come across some rabbis who were willing to talk to her and explain this prophecy to her. And then it was confirmed. It is the day the judgment of the nations begins. So what actually happened a year later on Rosh Hashanah of 2000? Let's take a look at this. On September 29th of 2000, which was Rosh Hashanah, Ariel Sharon went up onto the Temple Mount to pray, and riots broke out. Islam declared jihad, or holy war. So we can see that the first war cycle began on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, September 30th of 2000. Amazing. We can go back in history and we actually know that this happened. So we begin a first war cycle. Now take a look at this slide. I went out and charted the war cycles to see what's happened. So let's say now a war cycle, a 7-year war cycle began in the year of 2000. Let's take a look at that. So September 30th of 2000, the war cycle began. Jihad was declared. Well, what happened a year later? The U.S. was attacked on 9/11. So the war kind of spreads to the U.S. Then also in 2000, a financial crash happened. And during this 7-year war cycle, the Arab Spring begins. Now this war cycle ended September, Rosh Hashanah of 2007. What happens in the next 7-year cycle? Let's take a look. During this next 7-year cycle, September 13th of 2007 until 2014, we had the financial crash of 2008. Obama was elected President of the United States. And the Arab Spring spreads. During this 7-year time period, ISIS rises and declares a caliphate. And then Hamas comes to power and begins their attacks on southern Israel. All those things happened in the second 7-year war cycle. Pretty amazing. It's getting a little bit more intense. So the third 7-year war cycle began a year ago, September 24th of 2014, and it ends September 7th of 2021. So you can see on this chart, we have the beginning of the third war cycle. Let's take a look at what happened just in the first year of this third war cycle. We have what Jonathan Kahn has said, the predicted financial crash, the Shmita judgment of the financial system. That's coming up in September. But in this last year, ISIS has now expanded into the nations and begun their attacks in other places. We have increased persecution of the Jewish people, including the attacks in France, where President Netanyahu called for all the Jews to leave France, emigrate to Israel, where they can go be in their own country. And a lot of people are answering that call. The Jewish people are starting to leave France and other areas of the world and going back to Israel. So what else happened? We have here in the U.S. racial unrest and riots. We have the end of the U.S. Constitution, which is the same-sex marriage decision. And let me just say that what happened in that was the Supreme Court decided to rule not according to the Constitution, but in a sense laying the Constitution aside, and to rule on same-sex marriage. The Constitution doesn't say anything at all about marriage at all. So they kind of had to set the Constitution aside. So that was a significant ruling for them. And finally, the Pope is joining with the Palestinians who created a peace treaty. And we have finally the Iran nuclear peace treaty. Now that's just in the first year of this 7-year cycle. So we have these 3 war cycles that are happening. Now again, this is all making sense, but I wasn't quite sure what to make of all of this. So in the middle of that, let's take a look at this slide too. We have the blood moon eclipses, and those happen beginning the end of the last war cycle, beginning of this war cycle, 2014, 2015, with the midpoint in 2015. Those are all really significant. But let's ask ourselves, what does this have to do with end time prophecy? Now, this is where it gets interesting. Let's take a look at a prophetic story from the book of Genesis.